Welcome everybody. Here we move on to chapter 42 of the Count of Monte Cristo, the dinner. At first sight, the exterior of Monte Cristo's house at Auteuil presented nothing magnificent, nothing of what one would have expected of a house chosen for such a grand personage as the Count of Monte Cristo. But no sooner was the door opened than the scene changed. Monsieur Petruchio had certainly surpassed himself in the taste he had displayed in furnishing the house and in the rapidity with which the work had been executed. Just as formerly the Duke of Antin in one single night had an avenue of trees hewn down which obstructed Louis XIV's view, so Monsieur Petruchio in 3 days had an entirely bare yard planted with beautiful poplars and sycamores which gave shade to the whole of the house. Instead of the flagstones overgrown with grass, there extended a lawn which had only been laid down that morning, and now looked like a vast carpet, upon which still glistened the water with which it had been sprinkled. But then the Count himself had given all instructions. He had drawn up for Petruchio a plan indicating the number and position of the trees to be planted, and the shape and extent of the lawn that was to succeed the flagstones. That which best manifested the ability of the steward in the profound science of the master, the one in serving and the other in being served, was that this house, which had been deserted for 20 years and had appeared sad and gloomy on the previous evening, impregnated as it was with the insipid smell of decay, had, with its return to life, become permeated with his master's favorite perfumes, and had been given the system of lighting especially favored by him. Directly he arrived, the Count had his books and weapons at hand, his eyes rested upon his favorite pictures, and in the hall he was welcomed by his dogs, whose caresses he loved, and his birds in whose songs he rejoiced. Throughout the whole house, suddenly awakened from its long sleep like the Sleeping Beauty's castle in the wood, there burst forth life, song, and gaiety. Servants were merrily moving hither and thither across the fine courtyard. Those belonging to the kitchen were skipping down the staircase, but yesterday repaired, as though they had always inhabited the house. Others filled the coach houses, where the carriages were each numbered and each one had its allotted space, as though they had been installed there for the last 50 years. In the stables, the horses at the mangers were whinnying to the grooms, who spoke to them with considerably more respect than many a servant does to his master. The library was divided into 2 parts and contained about 2,000 books. One complete section was devoted to modern novels, and even the one that had only been published the day before was to be seen in its place, proudly displaying its red and gold binding. On the other side of the house, and matching the library, was a conservatory with exotic plants displayed in large Japanese pots, which were at once wonderful to behold and most pleasing in perfume. And in the middle of the conservatory there was a billiard table, which looked as if it had been abandoned about a year ago by players who had left the balls on the cloth. At 5 precisely the Count arrived, followed by Ali. Petruchio was waiting his arrival with impatience mingled with anxiety. He hoped for praise, yet he feared frowns. Monte Cristo alighted from his carriage in the courtyard, went over the whole house, and strolled through the garden in silence without giving the least sign of approval or disapproval. When he came to his bedroom, however, he pointed to a little piece of furniture in rosewood, saying, "The only use you can make of that is for my gloves." "If your excellency will open the drawer, he will find gloves in it," said Petruchio, delighted. In the various cupboards and drawers about the room, the Count found everything for his personal use, bottles of all kinds, cigars, jewelry. "Good," said he, and so real was the influence of this man on all around him that Monsieur Petruchio withdrew greatly elated. At 6 o'clock sharp, a horse was heard pawing the ground before the front door. It was our friend, the captain's horse, Medea. Monte Cristo awaited Morrel on the steps, a smile on his lips. "I am the first, I know," Morrel called to him. "I have done it on purpose, so as to have you to myself for a minute before the others come. Julie and Emmanuel sent you all kinds of messages. It is truly magnificent here. But are you sure your servants will take good care of my horse?" "You need not worry about that, my dear Maximilian. They understand horses. He will want rubbing down. If you knew what a pace I came, like the wind." "I should say so too, with a horse that cost 5,000 francs, said Monte Cristo in the tone that a father might adopt toward his son. "Do you regret it?" said Morrel with his frank smile. "Good gracious, no," replied the Count. "I should only regret it if the horse were no good." He is so good that I have outdistanced Monsieur de Chateau-Renaud, the greatest expert in France, and Monsieur Debray, who rides the minister's Arabs at their heels, are Baroness Danglars' horses, which always do their 6 leagues an hour. They are following you, then, asked the Count. See, here they are. Indeed, at that moment, a carriage drawn by a sweating pair of bays and 2 gentlemen on winded horses arrived at the gate which opened before them. The carriage drove round and stopped at the steps, followed by the 2 riders. Debray instantly dismounted and opened the carriage door. He offered his hand to the Baroness, who, in alighting, made a sign to Debray which passed unnoticed by all except Monte Cristo. Nothing ever escaped the Count's eye, and he perceived a note slipped almost imperceptibly and with an ease indicating practice from the Baroness's hand into that of the minister's secretary. The Baroness was followed by the banker, looking as pale as though he had issued from the grave instead of his carriage. Madame Danglars threw a rapid and inquiring glance around her, embracing in her view the courtyard, the peristyle, and the front of the house. Monte Cristo showed her 2 immense Chinese porcelain jars, on which was intertwined marine vegetation, the size and beauty of which denoted that it could but be the work of nature herself. The Baroness expressed great admiration. "Why, that would hold a chestnut tree from the Tuileries," she said. "How did they manage to bake such enormous jars?" "Oh, madame, that is a question we manufacturers of statues and fine glass cannot answer. It is the work of another age, that of the genii of the earth and sea." "What do you mean by that? To what period do these jars belong?" "I know not. I have heard it said, however, that the Emperor of China had an oven built for the purpose. In this oven 12 jars were baked, one after the other, like the one you see here. 2 were broken by the fierceness of the fire. The other 10 were sunk 300 fathoms deep into the sea. As though it knew what was demanded of it, the sea threw them over them its weeds, encircled them with coral, and encrusted them with shells, the whole thing being cemented by 200 years' submersion in the depths. For the emperor who made this experiment was carried away by a revolution, and left nothing but a document stating that the jars had been baked and let down into the sea. At the end of 200 years, this document was found, and it was decided to raise the vases. A special diving apparatus was made, and divers descended into the depths of the bay where they had been cast. Of the 10, however, but 3 were recovered. The others had been shattered and scattered by the waves. I like these vases, and at times my mind conjures up the unshapely, terrifying, and mysterious monsters, such as have been seen by divers only, which have cast their dull, cold, wandering gaze into the depths of the jars, wherein myriads of fish have slept, finding refuge there from the pursuit of their enemies. In the meantime, Danglars, caring little for curiosities, had been mechanically plucking one blossom after another from a magnificent orange tree. When tired of that tree, he turned his attention to a cactus which, being of a less easygoing character, pricked him outrageously. He rubbed his eyes with a shudder as though awakening from a dream. "Major Bartolomeo Cavalcanti, the Viscount Andrea Cavalcanti," announced Baptiste. A black satin frock, fresh from the maker's hands, a well-trimmed beard, and a gray mustache, a bold eye, a major's uniform decorated with 3 stars and 5 crosses. In short, the irreproachable bearing of an old soldier, such was the appearance of Bartolomeo Cavalcanti, the tender father. Close beside him in brand new clothes and with a smile upon his lips came Viscount Andrea Cavalcanti, the respectful son. The 3 young men chatted together. Their eyes wandered from the father to the son, from the very mature of these things rested longer on the latter, whom they began criticizing. "Cavalcanti," said Debray. "A fine name, to be sure," said Morel. "You are right," said Chateau-Renaud. "These Italians have a fine name, but they are badly dressed." "You are difficult to please," added Debray. "Their clothes are very well cut and are quite new. That is precisely where they are at fault. This gentleman looks as though he were dressed for the first time in his life." "Who are they?" Danglars inquired of Monte Cristo. "You've heard. The Cavalcantis." "That tells me their name, but nothing further. I had forgotten that you do not know Italian nobility. To speak of the Cavalcantis is the same as speaking of a princely race." "Any fortune?" asked the banker. "A fabulous one." "What do?" "They try to get through their fortune, but cannot succeed." From what they told me when they called on me the other day, I gather that they intended opening a credit account with your bank. I have invited them today on your account. I will introduce you to them. They appear to speak very good French. The son was educated at a college in the south, at Marseille or somewhere in that district, I believe. You will find him most enthusiastic. On what subject? Inquired the Baroness. On the subject of French women, madame. He has quite decided to find himself a wife in Paris. That is a fine idea, said Danglars, shrugging his shoulders. The Baron is very grim today, said Monte Cristo to Madame Danglars. Do they by any chance wish to make him a minister? Not so far as I know. I am more inclined to think he has been speculating and has lost money. Now he does not know who to blame for it. Monsieur and Madame de Villefort, announced Baptiste. 5 minutes later, the two doors of the salon opened. Petruchio appeared and announced in a loud voice, "Dinner is served, Your Excellency." Monte Cristo offered his arm to Madame de Villefort. "Monsieur de Villefort," said he, "will you escort Baroness Danglars?" Villefort did as he was requested, and they all passed into the dining room. The repast was magnificent. Monte Cristo had endeavored to deviate from the uniformity observed at all such Paris dinners, and his object was to satisfy the curiosity rather than the appetites of his guests. It was an oriental feast he offered them, but such as one would attribute to Arabian fairies. Every kind of delicious fruit that the 4 quarters of the globe can send to fill Europe's cornucopia was piled pyramid-like in Chinese vases and Japanese bowls. Rare birds in all their brilliant plumage, monstrous fish on silver dishes, every wine of the archipelago, Asia Minor, and the Cape, in decanters of every weird shape, the sight of which seemed to add to the flavor, passed like one of Apicius's reviews before his guests. Monte Cristo noticed the general amazement and began to laugh and jest about it. "My friends, you will no doubt admit," said he, "that arrived at a certain degree of fortune, the superfluous takes the place of the necessary, and, as you ladies will admit, arrived at a certain degree of exaltation, the ideal takes the place of the real. Now, to continue this argument, what is marvelous? That which we do not comprehend. What is truly desirable? That which we cannot have. Now, to see things I cannot understand, to procure things impossible of possession, such is the plan of my life. I can realize it by 2 means, money and will. For instance, I expected as much perseverance in the pursuit of a whim as you, Monsieur Danglars, would expend in constructing a new railway line, as you, Monsieur de Villefort, in condemning a man to death, as you, Monsieur Debray, in pacifying a kingdom, as you, Monsieur de Chateau-Renaud, in pleasing a lady, and you, Morel, in taming a horse that no one can ride. Thus, for example, you see these 2 fish. One was born 50 leagues from St. Petersburg, the other 5 leagues from Naples. Do you not find it amusing to unite them on the same table?" "What are these 2 fish?" asked Danglars. "Monsieur de Chateau-Renaud, who has lived in Russia, will tell you the name of the one, and Monsieur Cavalcanti, who is an Italian, will tell you the name of the other," said Monte Cristo. "This one is a sterlet, I believe," said Chateau-Renaud. "Capital! And if I mistake not," said Cavalcanti, "this one is the lamprey." "Just so. Now, Monsieur Danglars, ask these 2 gentlemen where these fish are found." "Starlets are only found in the Volga," said Chateau-Renaud. "And I know that the lake of Fusaro alone supplies lampreys of this size." "Exactly so. One comes from the Volga, the other from Lake Fusaro." "Impossible!" the guests exclaimed unanimously. "You see, this is precisely what affords me amusement. I am like Nero, cupitor impossibilitum. At the present moment it is amusing you too, and the reason why these fish, which, I dare say, are in reality not such good eating as perch or a salmon, seem exquisite, is that, in your opinion, it was impossible to procure them. Yet here they are. How did you have them brought to Paris? Nothing simpler. They were each brought in a large cask, the one lined with reeds and river weeds, the other with rushes and other lake plants. These were placed in a wagon built specially for them. Here the sterlet lived 12 days and the lamprey 8. Both of them were alive when my cook took them out of the casks to kill them, the former in the milk and the latter in wine. You do not believe me, Monsieur Danglars?" "At any rate, I doubt it," replied Danglars with a heavy smile. "Baptiste, send for another sterlet and lamprey," said Monte Cristo. "You know, those that came in the other casks and are still alive." Danglars opened his eyes in amazement. The rest of the company clapped their hands. 4 servants brought in 2 casks decorated with marine plants. In each was a panting fish similar to those on the table. But why are there two of each kind? Asked Danglars. Because one of them might have died, replied Monte Cristo simply. You are really a wonderful man, said Danglars. Philosophers may well say it is superb to be rich. Above all, to have ideas, said Madame Danglars. Oh, do not give me credit for this one, madame. It is an idea that was much esteemed by the Romans, and Pliny relates that they sent relays of slaves from Ostia to Rome, who carried on their heads fish of this species he calls mullus, which from the description he gives is probably the goldfish. It was considered a luxury to have them alive, and an amusing sight to see them die. When dying, they changed color 2 or 3 times, and like the fading rainbow, they passed through all the prismatic shades. Then they were sent to the kitchens. Their agony formed part of their merit. If they were not seen alive, they were despised when dead. Yes, but it is only 7 or 8 leagues from Ostia to Rome. Quite true, said Monte Cristo, but there would be the merit of living 1,800 miles after Lucullus if we did not go one better than he. The two Cavalcantis opened their enormous eyes wide, but they had the good sense not to say a word. This is all very amusing, said Chateau Renaud, but I must confess that what I admire most is the wonderful promptitude with which you are served. Is it not true, Count, that you bought this house only 5 or 6 days ago? Certainly no longer. Well, I am sure it has undergone complete transformation in a week, for, if I mistake not, it had quite a different entrance, and the yard was paved and empty, whereas what formerly was the yard is today a magnificent lawn bordered by trees which look 100 years old. Why not? I like grass and shade, said Monte Cristo. In 4 days, said Morrel. It is marvelous. The evening wore on. Madame de Villefort expressed her desire to return to Paris, which Madame Danglars did not dare to do, notwithstanding her obvious uneasiness. At his wife's request, Monsieur de Villefort was the first to give the signal for departure, and offered Madame Danglars a seat in his landau. As for Monsieur Danglars, he was so absorbed in a most interesting conversation on industry with Monsieur Cavalcanti that he did not pay any attention to what was going on around him. More and more delighted with the major, he offered him a seat in his carriage. Andrea Cavalcanti found his tilbury waiting him at the gate, and the groom, fitted out in an exaggeration of the prevailing English fashion, was standing on the tips of his high boots, holding the head of the enormous iron-gray horse. Andrea had not spoken much during dinner, but afterward he had been seized upon by Monsieur Danglars, who, after a rapid glance at the stiff-necked old major and his timid son, and taking into consideration the hospitality of the Count, had come to the conclusion that he was face to face with some nabob come to Paris to put the final polish on his society education. He had noticed with indescribable satisfaction the enormous diamond which shone on the major's little finger, and after dinner, of course, on pretext of business and travels, he questioned the father and son on their mode of living, and both the father and the son had been most charming and affable. He was, therefore, greatly pleased when Cavalcanti said, "Tomorrow, monsieur, I shall have the honor of calling on you on business matters." "And I shall be happy to receive you," was Danglars' reply, and he further proposed that he should accompany him to his hotel if it would not be depriving him too much of his son's company. Cavalcanti replied that for some time past his son had been accustomed to living independently of him. He had his own horses and carriages, and as they had not come to the Count's house together, it would offer them no difficulty to leave separately. The major had already seated himself in Danglars' carriage, and the banker took his place beside him. More and more charmed with the ideas of order and economy of this man who, notwithstanding, gave his son 50,000 francs a year, which meant an income of 500,000 or 600,000 francs. As for Andrea, in order to look grand, he began by reprimanding his groom because instead of driving up to the steps, he had waited at the gate, thus giving him the fatigue of walking 30 yards to reach his tilbury. The groom received the scolding with humility, and, taking the bit in his left hand to keep back the impertinent horse that was pawing at the ground, with his right hand he gave the reins to Andrea. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. So, Danglars has made a new friend. Let's see how that goes. See you next time.